Welcome to the Timeless Tales Library, where whispered stories become bridges to slumber. I'm Oliver, your evening companion, and tonight I've prepared a tranquil narrative to calm your thoughts and shepherd you toward peaceful dreams. The Timeless Tales Library flourishes through the kindness of souls like you. If these gentle tales have brought you solace, please subscribe and help us weave more of these restful journeys together. As you nestle into comfort, drop a note below sharing where in the world you're listening tonight, and tell me of a magical place you'd love a story to carry you, perhaps the floating gardens of Babylon, the crystal caves beneath the northern lights, the hidden tea houses of ancient Chengdu, or a lighthouse perched on the edge of a starlit sea. Your whispered wishes keep our cozy sanctuary alive with wonder. Tonight's story is about a gentle journey through golden meadows and whispering woods, where Jo March discovers the quiet magic that lives between the pages of an autumn afternoon. Let her peaceful wandering guide you toward rest. Now, close your eyes and take a deep breath, letting the worries of the day unroll and flatten out. You are entering the Golden Scroll Room, a special chamber within the Timeless Tales Library. This is a place for the oldest, most precious stories, tales written on scrolls of shimmering gold that glow with the warmth of a setting sun. The air is still, carrying a faint scent of old paper and quiet wisdom. Feel your body settle into the rich, soft fabric of your bed, your own personal alcove in this gilded room. Let the weight of your head, your arms, and your legs release. The golden glow of the scrolls fills the room, a gentle and comforting light that soothes your mind and body. Unroll the first scroll, let the words drift into your thoughts like dust motes in a sunbeam, leading you toward a deep and peaceful rest. Little Women's Jo March, a gentle sleep story, Jo's autumn wandering. The late October sun filtered through the lace curtains of the March family parlor, casting dancing shadows across the worn wooden floor where Jo sat with her writing desk balanced on her knees. Her pen had grown still in her hand, and she found herself gazing out the window at the maple tree that had transformed overnight into a cathedral of gold and crimson. The leaves seemed to glow with their own inner light, each one a tiny lantern swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. Marmee had gone to visit the Hummels, and her sisters were scattered about their various pursuits. Meg helping Hannah with the evening preparations, Beth at her piano practicing a new hymn, and Amy sketching by the garden window. The house held that particular quality of autumn quietude when the world seems to pause and breathe deeply, savoring the last warmth before winter's approach. Jo set aside her writing with unusual care. The story she'd been crafting about brave knights and daring rescues suddenly felt too sharp, too urgent for such a golden afternoon. Instead, she found herself drawn to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass as she watched a single leaf spiral down from the maple's highest branch, taking its time, dancing on invisible currents of air before settling gently on the garden path below. "I think I'll take a walk," she murmured to herself, the words barely disturbing the peaceful air of the parlor. It wasn't like Jo to speak so softly, but something about the autumn light seemed to call for whispers and gentle movements. She fetched her worn brown cloak from the hall tree, the one that had seen countless adventures, but today felt like an embrace of old friendship. As she stepped outside, The air greeted her with the scent of wood smoke from a distant chimney, the earthy sweetness of fallen apples, and something else, something indefinable that spoke of change and peace and the quiet satisfaction of harvest time. The garden gate creaked its familiar greeting, and Jo found herself walking not toward town as she usually did, but toward the meadow that stretched beyond the orchard, a path she'd taken countless times in spring and summer, but rarely in autumn. The worn track was carpeted now, with leaves that rustled softly beneath her boots, creating a gentle percussion that seemed to match the rhythm of her unhurried steps. As she walked, Jo noticed things she'd never seen before, or perhaps had never taken the time to truly observe. The way the afternoon light caught in spider webs stretched between fence posts, turning them into delicate works of art more beautiful than any lace Amy might embroider. The sound of her own breathing, steady and peaceful, harmonizing with the whisper of leaves above her head. The feeling of her cloak settling around her shoulders like the wings of some benevolent creature, protecting without constraining. The familiar meadow opened before her, but it seemed transformed. Where summer had brought wild grasses that reached her waist in green abundance, autumn had painted the world in shades of amber and rust. The grass had grown soft and fine, bending gracefully before the breeze like dancers in some grand, slow ballet performed for an audience of one. Jo found herself slowing even more, her usual brisk stride settling into something more like a meditation. Each step seemed to sink slightly into the earth, as if the meadow were welcoming her home after a long absence. She paused beside a cluster of wild asters, their purple faces turned toward the sun with the patient devotion of old friends keeping watch. In the center of the meadow stood an ancient oak tree, its trunk so wide that Jo and all her sisters together could not have encircled it with their arms. She'd climbed this tree countless times in her childhood, racing to the highest branches that would support her weight, but today she felt drawn to simply sit beneath its canopy. The ground at its base was soft with fallen leaves, creating a natural cushion more comfortable than any parlor chair. As she settled against the oak's sturdy trunk, Jo felt a sense of coming home that had nothing to do with houses or buildings. The tree seemed to welcome her with the patience of centuries, its bark rough and reassuring against her back, its branches spreading above her like the arms of some ancient guardian. She pulled her cloak around herself and simply breathed, letting the peace of the place seep into her bones. Time seemed to slow and stretch, becoming something more fluid than the tick of clocks or the chiming of hours. Jo found herself noticing the play of light through the oak's remaining leaves, how it shifted and danced as the branches moved almost imperceptibly in the breeze. Golden coins of sunlight scattered across her lap, warm despite the cool air, and she watched them flicker and dance like living things. A red squirrel appeared at the base of a nearby tree, its tail a banner of russet fur as it sat up on its haunches and regarded her with bright, curious eyes. Jo remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, and after a long moment the creature began to gather acorns, moving with efficient grace as it prepared for winter. There was something deeply satisfying about watching this simple, age-old ritual, this quiet preparation for the seasons to come. As she watched, more woodland creatures began to reveal themselves. A pair of chickadees flitted through the lower branches of the oak, their soft calls creating a gentle symphony with the rustle of leaves. A chipmunk appeared and disappeared among the roots, its cheeks bulging comically with seeds. These small beings went about their business with a peaceful purpose that Jo found deeply soothing, as if she were witnessing some secret ceremony of preparation and contentment. The sun continued its lazy journey across the sky, and Jo felt no urge to hurry or to move from her spot beneath the oak. Her usual restlessness, the energy that drove her to pace and gesticulate when she spoke, to fill every moment with activity and purpose, seemed to have been gently dissolved by the autumn air. Instead, she found herself content simply to exist in this moment, to be present without needing to do anything at all. She began to notice sounds she'd never heard before, or perhaps had never listened for. The soft whisper of wind through dry grass, the distant call of geese passing overhead on their long journey south, the creak of tree branches settling in the afternoon warmth. Each sound seemed to layer upon the others, creating a symphony of perfect peace that needed no conductor, no audience, only the simple act of being. As the afternoon progressed, Jo found her eyes growing heavy in the most pleasant way. Not the desperate tiredness that came after long days of helping Marmee with her charitable works, or the exhaustion that followed her passionate battles with particularly stubborn stories, but a gentle drowsiness that felt like a gift. She let her eyelids flutter closed and simply listened to the world around her, feeling more connected to the earth and sky than she ever had before. In this half-dreaming state, Jo began to imagine she could hear the very breath of the forest itself, the slow inhale and exhale of seasons changing, of leaves preparing to let go and settle into winter sleep, the patient heartbeat of the oak tree, steady and ancient, marking time in years rather than moments, the whispered conversations of creatures preparing for winter, sharing news and comfort in languages older than words. A warm breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the scent of distant wood smoke and the rich, loamy smell of earth settling into rest. Jo pulled her cloak closer and smiled without opening her eyes. This was what peace felt like, she realized. Not the absence of activity or excitement, but the presence of perfect contentment, of being exactly where she belonged at exactly the right moment. When she finally opened her eyes, the quality of light had shifted. The sun hung lower in the sky, painting everything with a warmer, more golden glow. The shadows had grown longer, stretching across the meadow like gentle fingers, and the air had taken on the crisp edge that spoke of evening approaching. But there was no urgency in this recognition, no sudden panic about the time. Instead, Jo felt as if she had been gifted with extra hours, bonus time carved out from the regular world for this perfect afternoon. She became aware of a new sound, the soft flutter of wings, and looked up to see a great blue heron settling by the small creek that bordered the far edge of the meadow. The magnificent bird stood motionless for a long moment, its reflection wavering in the slow-moving water before beginning to wade with careful, deliberate steps. Joe watched in wonder as the heron paused, head cocked with infinite patience, before striking quick as lightning at some unseen fish beneath the surface. The grace and deliberation of the heron's movements seemed to embody everything Joe had been feeling about this afternoon. There was no hurry, no wasted motion, only perfect presence and attention to the moment at hand. She found herself breathing in rhythm with the bird's careful steps, her own heartbeat slowing to match the patient rhythm of this wild, beautiful creature. As she watched, the heron lifted its great wings and took flight, its movements so smooth and powerful that it seemed to float rather than fly. Joe followed its progress across the meadow and over the distant trees until it disappeared into the golden distance, leaving her with a sense of having witnessed something sacred, a reminder of the wild grace that lived at the heart of the world. The afternoon light was beginning to take on the honeyed quality that came just before sunset, and Joe knew she should think about heading home. But the thought held no anxiety, no sense of duties left undone or time wasted. Instead, she felt full to overflowing with the richness of these quiet hours, as if she'd been fed some essential nourishment she hadn't even known she'd been missing. She rose slowly from her place beneath the oak, taking a moment to brush the leaves from her cloak and to place her hand once more against the tree's sturdy trunk. "Thank you," she whispered, and though she couldn't have said exactly what she was thanking the tree for, the words felt necessary and right. As she began to walk back across the meadow, Joe found that her steps had taken on a new quality. She moved more slowly than usual, not from tiredness but from a desire to savor each moment of the journey home. The grass whispered different stories to her now, tales of summer's abundance and winter's coming rest. The air carried different messages, speaking of change and continuation, of the eternal cycle of seasons that connected all things. The path through the orchard felt like walking through a gallery of masterpieces. Each apple tree was heavy with fruit, the apples glowing like lanterns in the slanted light. Some had fallen to the ground, where they lay among the fallen leaves like gifts left by generous spirits. Joe paused to pick up one that had just fallen, its skin still warm from the sun, and took a small bite. The juice was sweet and sharp at once, tasting of sunshine and rain, of all the patient months of growing and ripening. As she walked, Joe began to notice details she'd somehow missed on her way out, despite taking the same path. The way the light caught in the windows of distant farmhouses, making them glow like eyes full of warm welcome. The smoke rising straight up from chimneys, creating delicate columns that dissolved into the clear air. The way the fence posts were decorated with wisps of sheep's wool left behind from spring pasturing, now weathered to the softness of clouds. A barn cat appeared on the stone wall that bordered the lane, a ginger Tom with white mittens who regarded her passage with calm green eyes. Joe paused to speak to him, and to her delight he responded with a rumbling purr and rubbed his head against her outstretched hand. His fur was warm from sunbathing, and his purr seemed to vibrate through her entire being, adding another layer to the peace that had been building in her heart all afternoon. "Have you been having as lovely an afternoon as I have?" she asked him softly, and he responded by sitting down and beginning to wash his face with careful precision, as if to demonstrate that every moment could be lived with such deliberate grace. This afternoon walk wasn't just a physical journey for Joe, it was a profound emotional and spiritual one. The stillness of the meadow provided a counterpoint to the internal landscape she so often navigated, a world of ambition, frustration, and fiery emotion. Joe, a character defined by her energetic, sometimes chaotic, drive, was a force of nature in the March household. Her passions burned bright, whether they were for a new story, a debate with Amy, or a spirited game of charades. But in the hushed, golden light of this autumn day, that inner fire was banked, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. This shift in her state of being was a gift from the season itself. Autumn, with its gentle decline and sense of a world preparing for rest, invited a different kind of existence. It was a season of introspection, of looking inward rather than outward. For Joe, whose gaze was usually fixed on the future, on the next story she would write, the next great adventure she would have, this was a rare and valuable opportunity. She was forced to be present, to simply be, without the pressing need to do. The quiet of the meadow allowed a deeper layer of her personality to surface, one often overshadowed by her boisterous, restless nature. This was the Joe who cherished her family and her home, the one who found comfort in the worn familiarity of her cloak and the creak of the garden gate. The Joe who, for all her ambition to escape her small-town life, was deeply rooted in the soil of her childhood. In the peaceful solitude, she was able to recognize and appreciate this part of herself, a part she hadn't fully acknowledged before. The meadow was a mirror, reflecting her own deep need for peace and stillness, a need that was often buried beneath her vibrant energy. As Joe delved deeper into her walk, the world around her began to reveal itself in a new and intimate way. It was a transformation from a broad, painted landscape into a rich tapestry woven from countless tiny, intricate threads. Before, the meadow was simply the meadow, a space for running and games. Now, it was a living, breathing entity, a collection of small miracles she had been too busy to notice. The spider webs, once invisible, became glittering works of art, each thread a testament to quiet, patient labor. The leaves that had been a simple carpet beneath her feet were now a gentle percussion, a musical accompaniment to her unhurried steps. The wild asters were not just flowers, but old friends, their purple faces turned to the sun with a quiet devotion that resonated with Joe's own growing sense of peace. Each detail was a note in the symphony of the afternoon, and Joe, by slowing down, had finally learned to listen to the music. This focus on the small things was a lesson in mindfulness. It taught her that beauty wasn't only found in grand, sweeping gestures, the heroic acts of her fictional knights, or the passionate declarations of her characters. It was also present in the delicate, everyday moments of the natural world. The red squirrel's purposeful gathering of acorns was a story in itself, a narrative of instinct and preparation that was just as compelling as any she could invent. The chickadees and the chipmunk were small actors in this play of quiet existence, each one a reminder of the simple, satisfying rhythm of life. The ancient oak tree became the heart of Joe's journey, both physically and metaphorically. It wasn't just a place to sit, it was a sanctuary, a living symbol of permanence and patience. Joe's earlier adventures in the tree, scrambling to the highest branches, were a reflection of her youthful restlessness and her desire to climb, to achieve. But today, she didn't need to conquer the tree, she simply needed to be embraced by it. Sitting against its sturdy trunk, she felt a sense of belonging that transcended the physical boundaries of her home. The oak, with its patient, centuries-old existence, offered a perspective that was much grander than her own. It reminded her that life was not a frantic race, but a slow, unfolding process, marked by the gradual turning of seasons and the quiet strength of things that endure. The warmth of the sun and the coolness of the air were not in opposition but in harmony, just as the contrasting parts of her own personality, her fiery ambition, and her deep need for peace could coexist. The sense of timelessness she felt beneath the oak was the ultimate gift. Joe, who was so often governed by deadlines and the urgency of her creative impulses, was freed from the tyranny of the clock. Time became fluid, stretching to accommodate the simple act of breathing and being. This was a form of meditation, a release from the pressures of her self-imposed expectations. In this state, she could hear the breath of the forest itself, a metaphorical sound that represented her newfound connection to something larger than herself. It was a communion with the earth, a deep resonance that filled the empty spaces in her soul. The appearance of the great blue heron marked the climax of Joe's afternoon. This magnificent bird, a symbol of grace, patience, and purpose, was a living embodiment of the lessons she had been learning. Its deliberate, unhurried movements were in stark contrast to Joe's usual hurried pace. The heron didn't rush to catch its prey. It waited with infinite patience and then struck with swift, precise action. It was a powerful metaphor for Joe's own creative process. She had been trying to force her stories, to write with a restless urgency, but the heron showed her that true purpose and success come from a place of stillness and mindful attention. The heron's flight, so smooth and powerful that it seemed to float rather than fly, was the final indelible image of the day. It represented a new way of being for Joe, a way of moving through the world with grace and power without unnecessary struggle. Watching the bird disappear into the golden light left her with a sense of having witnessed something sacred, a moment of profound revelation. She hadn't found what she was looking for on this walk. She hadn't even been looking for anything, but she had found what she needed. The final leg of her journey home was not a return to the ordinary, but a continuation of her newfound grace. The details she noticed now, the apple trees glowing like lanterns, the smoke rising like delicate columns, were not just observations, but affirmations of the beauty she was now capable of seeing. The sweet and sharp taste of the fallen apple was a microcosm of her own life, full of both challenging and delightful moments, each one necessary for a full and rich experience. Even the barn cat became a teacher, its careful, deliberate movements demonstrating the dignity in simple daily tasks. Jo's walk was a gentle pilgrimage of the soul. She had left her home a restless, ambitious girl, and returned a soul full of a quiet, abiding peace. She had learned that the most important stories were not always the ones written with a pen, but the ones lived in moments of stillness and grace, in the quiet golden light of an autumn afternoon. The world outside had not changed, but her perception of it had been forever transformed. The lane led her past the Moffat house, where she could see Mrs. Moffat working in her kitchen garden, harvesting the last of the winter squash. The older woman looked up and waved, her face creased in a smile that spoke of her own satisfaction with the autumn afternoon. Jo waved back, feeling connected to this neighbor in a new way, as if they were both part of some quiet conspiracy of contentment. As she approached home, Jo could see the warm glow of lamplight beginning to appear in the windows of the March house. The sight filled her with a different kind of happiness than she'd felt in the meadow, not the wild, expansive joy of being at one with the natural world, but the warm, gathering joy of family and belonging. Both feelings seemed to complement each other perfectly, like two notes in a harmony she was only just beginning to understand. The garden gate welcomed her with its familiar creak, and Jo paused for a moment on the garden path to look back toward the meadow. She couldn't see it from here, but she could feel its presence, like a secret she carried in her heart. The memory of the afternoon glowed within her, warm and golden, a treasure she could return to whenever the world seemed too harsh or hurried. Beth's music drifted through the parlor window, not the hymn she'd been practicing earlier, but something softer, more improvised. The melody seemed to capture something of Jo's afternoon mood, gentle and wandering, full of quiet joy. Jo smiled, wondering if her sister had somehow sensed the peace she was bringing home and was offering her own musical welcome. As she reached the front door, Jo paused with her hand on the handle. She didn't want this feeling to end, didn't want to return to the ordinary world of conversations and duties and the bright urgency of family life. But as she stood there, she realized that the peace she'd found wasn't something that would disappear the moment she stepped inside. It had become part of her, woven into her very being during those golden hours beneath the oak tree. The door opened before she could turn the handle, and there was Marmee, her face glowing with the warmth that always surrounded her like a visible blessing. "There you are, dear," she said softly, studying Jo's face with the penetrating kindness that saw everything and judged nothing. "You look different, peaceful. Did you have a good walk?" "Oh, Marmee," Jo said, and found that she couldn't possibly explain the richness of her afternoon in words. It was perfect, just perfect. Marmee smiled and drew her inside, helping her out of her cloak. "Sometimes the world gives us exactly what we need, doesn't it? Even when we don't know we need it." The warmth of the house enveloped Jo like an embrace, and she realized that the peace she'd found in the meadow didn't conflict with the love and activity of home. Instead, it made everything more vivid, more precious. The lamplight seemed warmer, the voices of her sisters more musical, the very air more welcoming. Amy looked up from her sketching as Jo entered the parlor, her face bright with curiosity. "You look like you've been somewhere magical," she said. "Your eyes are all dreamy." "I have been somewhere magical," Jo replied, settling into her favorite chair by the window, "but it wasn't far away at all." Beth finished her improvised melody and turned on the piano bench, her gentle face glowing with interest. "Tell us," she said simply, and something in her tone suggested she understood that this was a story worth hearing. So Jo began to tell them about her afternoon, choosing her words carefully to capture not just what had happened, but how it had felt. She spoke of the quality of light in the meadow, of the ancient patience of the oak tree, of the heron's perfect grace, and the red squirrel's busy contentment. As she spoke, she watched her sisters' faces soften, as if they too were being touched by the peace she had discovered. Meg joined them, settling into her sewing chair with her mending, but her hands grew still as she listened. Even Hannah appeared in the doorway, drawn by the unusual quality of Jo's voice, soft and unhurried in a way that was unlike her usual animated storytelling. "It sounds," Beth said when Jo had finished, "like you found a place where time moves differently." "Yes," Jo said, grateful that someone understood. "Exactly like that, as if I stepped outside of ordinary time into something deeper." "The autumn does that sometimes," Mommy observed, looking up from her own needlework. "It invites us to slow down, to notice things we've been too busy to see. The world preparing for rest teaches us something about the value of stillness." As the evening settled around them, Jo found that the peace from her afternoon continued to flow through her. When Amy asked for help with a difficult passage in her French lesson, Jo's usual impatience was nowhere to be found. When Meg worried aloud about a small household problem, Jo listened with a calmness that surprised them both. When Beth played her evening hymn, Jo heard layers in the music she'd never noticed before. Later, as she prepared for bed, Jo found herself moving with the same deliberate grace she'd observed in the heron. Each action, brushing her hair, folding her clothes, turning down her bed, became a small meditation, a way of honoring the peace that still flowed through her veins like warm honey. She opened her bedroom window despite the cool air, wanting to stay connected to the world outside. The night was clear and still, with stars beginning to appear like tiny lanterns in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the soft hoot of an owl, and she smiled, thinking of all the creatures settling into their own evening routines. As she slipped between the cool sheets, Jo realized that she felt different in some fundamental way. Not changed, exactly, but more herself than she'd ever been before. The restlessness that usually drove her seemed to have been replaced by something steadier, more sustainable. She thought of the oak tree, rooted deep in the earth but reaching always toward the sky, and understood that she had found her own way of being both grounded and growing. The memory of her afternoon glowed warm in her mind as she drifted towards sleep. She could still feel the sun on her face, still hear the whisper of wind through autumn grass, still see the perfect grace of the heron's flight. These images and sensations seemed to wrap around her like a second blanket, soft and warm and infinitely comforting. Just before sleep claimed her, Jo made herself a promise. She would return to that meadow, to that patient oak tree, whenever the world became too urgent or demanding. She would remember that there were places where time moved differently, where peace was not the absence of activity, but the presence of perfect contentment. She would carry this autumn afternoon with her always, a secret garden of the heart that no one could take away. And as sleep finally wrapped her in its gentle embrace, Jo's last conscious thought was a whisper of gratitude for autumn light and patient trees, for the grace of wild creatures and the love of family, for afternoons that felt like gifts and evenings that held the promise of peaceful dreams. The night settled softly around the March house, and Jo March slept the deep, contented sleep of one who has discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures are the quietest ones, and that peace is not something to be found but something to be recognized, always present and waiting like an old friend beneath the nearest tree.